All right. I do have a PowerPoint. It's not fancy though. It's literally white writing on black background. And there's quite a lot of slides just because I wanted to put various quotes I'm engaging with up on there. There are quotes on your outline. Some of them I will read through. Others are just for you to take home and read and perhaps follow up if you'd like to. It's probably a bit of an unusual place to start an academic paper by talking about a tweet, but that's what I'm going to do. In July last year, a well-known Christian leader in the US tweeted about the changes that had been wrought on marriage, sex, family, and relationships across the last few decades. And he wrote about how the US has departed from a Christian ethic of romance, sex, and family in popular behaviour. Our nation, he says, never completely adhered to that ethic, but the radical departure from it started in the 1960s. Now, even a basic understanding of 20th century American history, and indeed 20th century Western history, would suggest that he's put his finger on something here. The second half of last century was characterised by revolutionary change across the social, cultural, political, legal, ideological spectrum. And in many ways, the household was indeed ground zero for that change. A radical departure did indeed start in the 1960s. But what was it a departure from? For this leader, it was a departure from the Christian ethic of romance, sex, and family. Other evangelical commentators today frequently express similar concerns, but they use different language. They talk about leaving behind or a loss of the traditional family, the natural family, or perhaps even the biblical family. Traditional, natural, biblical. These adjectives are frequently used as synonyms of not what simply the Christian family, or in line with our theme today, the Christian household, should be, but also of what it used to be and what it needs to be once more. However, I think there are some important questions for us to ask of these descriptors: traditional, biblical, natural, Christian. For example, what exactly makes a household a Christian household as opposed to a not Christian household? What might we say is traditional about this form of the household, and exactly how far back does that tradition go? While it might be self-evident that there is indeed something natural about family, to what extent is the way that we humans do family necessarily also cultural? When we speak of the biblical family, what parts of Scripture define what that biblical family or that biblical household is, and how do they do that? These questions and other like them suggest that the definition of the biblical, traditional, natural Christian household that we talk about today in our common conversations is actually, I think, an immensely complex task. Norwegian theologian, whose name I'm not going to pronounce right, I'm sure, Halvor Moxnes, explains why this is so. He says, "It is not therefore sufficient to study what family is in itself. It is always part of a wider societal context and has a cultural meaning. In order to understand the function and the place of the family, we must have a grasp of the larger social pattern of which it is a part." To put it another way, the institution of the family or the household is not some abstract reality that can ever just exist in mere theory. It's not this kind of ideal out there and that's where it stays. Every family, every household is embedded in a particular time, in a particular place, in a particular context. As Moxnes writes, it's always part of a wider societal context. The human household is a contingent reality. Now, that the household is contingent does not mean that there is nothing fundamental about it. It doesn't mean that there is no theological truth which needs to be brought to bear in our discussions on this topic, not at all. But the household's historical contingency does mean that we ought to be slow to conclude that there is a timelessly right expression of exactly what the household is, has always been, and is always meant to be. And it means as Christians we must be very cautious about designating one particular historical form or expression of the household as the traditional or the natural or the biblical or the Christian household. To better understand the implications of the household's contingency, we're going to spend our time tracing very quickly, in very broad outline, through about 3,000 years of history, before we arrive at some broad conclusions about the implications of this for the way we think about Christianity and households today. But before we embark on that historical journey, we first need to flesh out a little bit more exactly what is usually meant by the contemporary evangelical reference to the Christian household in conversation today. If the biblical or the traditional family needs to be recaptured in today's society because we've departed from it, then what precisely are its hallmarks? What are its features such that we will know whether we have rediscovered and reapplied it or not? Well, a 2021 Desiring God article provides, I think, a helpful entry point into this discussion. According to the author of How Does God Define Family? The family, he says, is the husband and wife pair along with their children for as long as they remain under the parent's care. Now, family defined in this way seems entirely unobjectionable, doesn't it? Especially from a Christian theological perspective. And this definition certainly provides a very important counterpoint to the devastating fragmentation that is occurring between husbands and wives, between parents and children in Western society today. Christians also typically use this kind of basic definition interchangeably with the phrase the nuclear family. In this sense, the answer to the question of what is the traditional Christian natural biblical family is often presented as a fairly straightforward one. It's the nuclear family, mum, dad, and kids living together in a stable environment. But things are more complicated than that, because you see, in writing an article titled How Does God Define Family?, the author doesn't only write that one simple sentence and then leave it at that. Instead, he rightly fleshes out this definition of what the Christian family or the Christian household is by exploring how this nuclear family unit operates within its broader societal context. He discusses the way in which this self-contained household chooses to engage, or chooses perhaps not to engage, with those who are not part of it, including extended family, the wider community around them, friends, and the church. To put it another way, the nuclear family is never only defined by the relationships that exist between the members of that particular household. Rather, the nuclear family is also defined by the extent to which it does or does not relate to those outside it. And that's why the nuclear family concept is, I want to suggest, maybe often used, irresponsibly and at times even a bit disingenuously in Christian discourse. Over and over again, contributors to that discourse present the definition of the Christian household as obviously basic: mum, dad, and kids living together in a stable environment. We're told that this is all the nuclear family means. But in both theory and practice, that is not only what the contemporary construct of the nuclear family actually means. When the term was originally coined by an Austrian-Hungarian anthropologist in the earliest 20th century, the nuclear family referred not simply to the sense in which a husband and a wife and children were vitally linked to one another in relationship, but also to the sense in which that relationship itself was considered absolutely central to a broader network of relationships. That is, mum, dad, and kids were the nucleus of the atom around which a whole series of other relationships were intimately connected and, in fact, which they revolved. However, during the course of the 20th century, for some reasons that we'll see a little bit later on, this notion of the nuclear family underwent significant reconceptualisation and even redefinition, and it became this. The nucleus of the atom was moved to being that which is isolated from the larger relational system and instead becomes its own self-contained, detached unit in its own right. It moves from being the core of the atom to being separate to the rest of the atom. The relationships which had once revolved directly around the nucleus were now off to the side. Furthermore, the nucleus now primarily interacted with those other relationships as it determined was in its best interests. So the Desiring God article demonstrates this shift. Immediately after the author gives his definition of family as husband, wife, and children, he goes on to say, the family certainly loves and supports other social groups, particularly the extended family and church community, but the natural or domestic family is never absorbed or replaced by these groups. Instead, families love and support others precisely by being the right kind of families. In the context of this article, the author presents the family unit as a self-contained, self-sustaining, singular identity that is not actually part of a bigger whole. It contributes to the bigger whole in some ways, but it is not part of the bigger whole. The way that the nuclear household best supports the bigger whole of network of relationships is by being distinct from it and separate to it, by making sure it is the right kind of family in and of itself. Now, we could talk about this for a lot longer, and maybe we will in question time, but we have roughly 3,000 years of household history to make our way through. So in the interest of moving on, let me give you what I think is a very concise definition, not my own, somebody else's, of what is actually meant by the phrase nuclear family in our day and age. And so also what I actually think when we read between the lines, Christians tend to have in mind when we typically refer to the traditional or natural or biblical household. Bradley says, in today's world, the phrase nuclear family conjures up an image of a domestic unit comprising two parents and their children who live together in a single family residence and who share a deep, effective intimacy with one another. Under these conditions, the modern nuclear family is an institution that is characterised above all by privacy. Okay, keep that definition just percolating in the back of your mind as we begin to explore the historical and also the theological contingency of the household. As I said, this is going to be fast and furious. I'm sorry, I'm going to be talking in very broad overview. We're going to be moving through various eras very quickly. So if you want to do more research, you can check out the bibliography that I have attached there. We're going to start by considering the historically contingent ancient Israelite household. And I'll give the game away at the beginning with this quote from Rosemary Radford Ruther, who says, there are several types of family in Hebrew scripture, none of which corresponds with the modern nuclear model. As we would expect across a historical span of many hundreds of years, Israelite kinship and household networks existed in a state of some flux. Prior to the establishment of the monarchy, the Israelites likely lived in small agricultural communities of about 50 to 100 people, divided up across 6 to 10 households, which included father and mother, or perhaps mothers, at least some of their adult sons, and those sons' children and wife. When their daughters married, they typically left their father's household and they became part of their husband's father's household. Sojourners, servants, and others also formed part of these households. Radford Ruther notes that with the rise of the monarchy, threatened the self-sufficiency of these peasant households and villages, and the threat was aggravated by successive empires with their colonial occupying armies and administrations. This social and political fragility in the time of the New Testament had a range of implications on the form and the expressions of how Israelites lived in households across the centuries. But one thing that remained constant was that members of the Israelite household, and indeed the larger kinship community, men and women, young and old, parent and child, stranger and biological family member, were all expected to actively contribute to the economic production of the household. In a very real sense, all of the members of the household needed each other to survive. Marriages were typically contracted for children by their fathers, with neither spouse to be in a position normally to exercise any significant personal agency in that decision. These arranged marriages were contracted on the basis of particular political, economic, social, and theological benefits that it would bring to both households and indeed to the broader clan or kinship network. There is no such thing as a single-person household in ancient Israel. Marriage was essential for the Israelites. And the reason for this is because the Israelite household wasn't simply a social construct, it was also a theological one. God's covenant with Abraham was the theological cornerstone of the Israelite corporate identity. Every member of the Israelite nation was expected to embrace the privileges but also the responsibility of that covenant by marrying and bearing children. The barren woman and the eunuch were regarded as tragically marginal and impoverished individuals who benefited from the covenantal community while not being able to directly contribute to it. All of this is to say that if we were to look back at the household in this part of the Bible as being the biblical or traditional household, then what we would have in mind are intergenerational agrarian households based around the patriarchal line, living and working together in extended kinship community, participating in arranged marriages contracted for the purposes of alliances, and with an urgent emphasis on procreation as an essential way of participating in that covenant community. As Grant concludes, though the boundaries around the family became more defined as the nomadic period ended and settled agricultural and urban life began in ancient Israel, they never reached anything approaching the central loyalty to the marriage found in much Western society today, and in the contemporary Middle East, they still don't. So, we move along on our journey of the household heading into the Christian era. Now, the reality is that the early Christian church is yet another one characterised by hundreds of years of not just historical but also political and religious complexity. Understanding the household in the earliest and early church is complicated even further by the fact that there are actually two distinct historical and social contexts at work. There is the Palestinian Jewish context and there's the Greco-Roman pagan context. Because we've just spent some time familiarising ourselves with the broad Jewish understanding of how the household existed, certainly in the Old Testament, I just want us to focus a little more closely on the significance of the Greco-Roman context to the household. In Roman law and parlance, the word familia meant something very different from the English word family. Familia referred to persons and things under the sovereign control of the male head of the household, or the paterfamilias. That is to say, in the Greco-Roman familia, that didn't simply include the paterfamilias. In fact, he wasn't a member of the familia. He ruled over the familia. He wasn't a member of it. It included his wife and his children, but it also included his slaves, any ex-slaves who were still in some way bound to him, freedmen or freedwomen who worked for him, wet nurses, unmarried relatives, clients he provided for, and even the animals within his household. That was the familia. Grown sons who married generally remained under their father's authority until his death. When a daughter married, she didn't automatically come under her new husband's authority, but she typically remained under her father's rule, even if she didn't live in his household. Although Roman law protected both men and women from being forced into marriage without their consent, in reality, marriages were almost always arranged by the paterfamilias with his household's social and political benefit in mind. While it was noble families for whom this household system was most clearly defined, commoners lived within the orbit of the same system. They generally actually looked to attach themselves to one of these large households for their own economic and social survival. The Greco-Roman household also did not have anything of our modern notion of the family as a private space or secluded refuge. Kramer notes that the household was one of the most important places for both conducting business and for the production of saleable goods. The house was not the place to escape from work, but the place where much of work was done. Furthermore, Greco-Roman society was an honour-shame society. In this historical context, honour wasn't our contemporary sense of a kind of personal sense of inner integrity. Rather, honour, and so also shame, was about knowing your place, your situation within a household and your community, and making sure you acted in a way that was consistent with that for the sake of your household and your community. This meant that the honour-shame construct was the very basis of relationships within the Greco-Roman household. A servant's behaviour reflected directly on his master's honour. A father's honour was directly linked to his son's actions. The honour of the male members of the familia were reliant upon the modesty of its women. A husband's honour was contingent upon the chastity of his wife. What this meant was that the goal of the arranged marital relationship of a husband and wife in this time was not one of love and romance, but one of concordia. That is, I haven't got it here, I'll have to just read it to you. Concordia, a state of harmony between husband and wife that was hoped for when marriage began and celebrated once attained by outsiders. It implied a state of tranquil and stable unanimity, but suggested little of the romance or intimacy typical of modern marriage. All of this was the pagan context in which the early church emerged and existed, and as Claire told us this morning, at times countered and challenged. This was the setting, the societal cultural setting of pagan households in those first few centuries that Christians actually converted from. Now, there is so much more to say about the notion of the Christian household in the early church. I mean, I'm only just talking about really the immediate Greco-Roman context. There's centuries and centuries in the early church. But there's also the biblical relationship here. How did Jesus and the epistles' authors' teaching on the family and the household interact and counter-interact this historical context? How does knowing this historical household context better inform our understanding of Jesus' call to be ready to leave behind mothers and fathers and brothers and sisters, as well as home and fields, for his sake? And of course, what does all of this mean for Christ's creation of the new household, the church as a family of God? Frustratingly, I discovered as I was writing this paper, all of this lies well beyond the scope of what we're trying to do now. Our aim is significantly more modest. It's namely just to appreciate how historically contingent even the earliest of Christian households really were in the way that they actually expressed themselves and were formed in the context of their society. As Moxnes concludes, it's not the family as an emotional unit that we encounter in the gospel or the epistles, but rather as a group that lives and works together within the context of socio-economic interrelations. Now, if you thought we moved through the previous two eras very quickly, brace yourself for the Middle Ages. The reason for such a flying visit of this 1,000-year period of history is twofold. Firstly, it simply covers an immense period of time and geography, and we can only very briefly kind of do an overview. But secondly, I want to take a little bit more time in the back half of the second millennium. So, Middle Ages, very broad contours. The nature and the structure of the household in this period was deeply affected by various political developments of the era, which in turn were closely tied to religious developments of the era. Who ruled and how they ruled was constantly changing, particularly in Western Europe, and so the household was caught up in riding the waves of those changes. Karl writes, family ties, either of blood or of marriage, were important in determining political alliances and in advancing access to benefactors. Amongst the nobles, marriage and procreation had a fundamentally utilitarian and even mercenary function. Making the right decisions in these areas helped you get in charge and helped you stay in charge. Making the wrong decisions could be catastrophic. But of course, the nobles only formed a tiny percentage of the population. The vast majority of people, chances are you and I at that time would have been commoners, largely peasants and serfs making an agrarian living. The feudal system of the medieval era meant that a very large portion of us commoners would have been legally bound to a landowner who was our feudal lord. We would have paid him taxes to work and harvest a portion of his land. And because he had a vested interest in us doing well and making more money for him, he wanted us to be married, because two was always better than one. Indeed, some landowners had the right to select the spouses for their peasants for them. Others had to pay an additional tax to their landowners in order to be able to make that choice themselves. Not only did the ruling lord have a vested interest in his commoners' marriages, but so did their neighbours. You see, the very geography of village life and peasant farming made marriage a public matter. Everyone had a stake in who married whom and whether the new husband or wife would be an asset to the neighbourhood. As the Middle Ages progressed, households became somewhat smaller. No longer did newly married couples tend to continue living with their fathers. Instead, they usually established their own independent household on a feudal lord's land. One of the implications of this that I found really interesting when I read it was that because both men and women, because they needed to be able to be in a position largely to establish their own household, separate to their parents, often people in the Middle Ages didn't marry until their 30s and even their 40s, men and women alike, because they needed the time to save up to be able to establish their own household. It made me think of living in Sydney today. But the picture we see of the household, of the husband-wife household of the Middle Ages is still, even though it is smaller than previously, remarkably different to the privatised, effectively bound and isolated nuclear family of today. As Stephanie Kuntz concludes, even among the middle classes, households typically included servants or lodgers, and day-to-day interactions were likely to be with neighbours, servants or community institutions rather than with kin. But this is an era when we do begin to see some gradual and significant changes to the internal character of the household and the relationships within it. This is the beginning of something. For example, while marital decisions were rarely remained a matter of individual choice, normally parents and community were the ones who made this decision largely on your behalf, the working partnership nature of those marriages meant there was a lot at stake in creating and maintaining household relationships that were agreeable and even harmonious. For your sake, not simply your family's sake, but for your sake, it really mattered who you married and how well you got on with them. And finally, as Grant explains, the idea of individuality was emerging in this period as leading citizens began to be publicly fascinated with what was unique about themselves and those they were familiar with. This created a situation in which the uniqueness of the spouse was noticed and celebrated in literature, and the way was opening for a less functional and more personal model of marriage. So you can see, we're beginning to see something here. All of these factors combined serve to lay important groundwork for the effective marital and familial revolution that would come in the early modern and in the modern period, starting with the Reformation. Now, Rachel is going to be presenting a whole paper on marriage in the Reformation today. I'm really looking forward to that because I am more and more aware of how absolutely foundational what happened in the Reformation was for how we think, not just about marriage and singleness, but also about sex and family and community now. So, leaving that for her, I'm going to make a few very brief remarks about the historical contingency of the Reformation household before moving on to spend a little bit more time thinking about something we may be a little less familiar with, which is the significance of Puritanism for our discussion. Obviously, the Reformation was a complete game changer when it came to the household, both historically and theologically. For instance, among the implications of the Reformers' unrelenting criticism of institutional celibacy was their reframing of sex as a biological necessity and their rehabilitation of marriage as a creative good. Yet one of the things that we're perhaps less aware of is the way that the Reformers emphasised the role of companionship in marriage. Previously, historical iterations of the household, as we've seen, recognised companionship as a necessary implication of marriage. In the Greco-Roman context, we saw that the honour-shame goal of concordia between a husband and wife is what characterised their relationship. In the Middle Ages, we saw the importance of harmony between a husband and wife for the sake of the productive household. But during the time of the Reformation, this aspect of the marital relationship became less a kind of welcome implication of being married and something you needed to be able to work through and hopefully achieve and realise well. And it became a purpose for marriage. Companionship became a purpose for marriage. This was exemplified by Cranmer in the 1549 prayer book when he added a third justification for marriage to the classical two, which were remedy for sin and propagation of Christian children. The additional wording was mutual society, help and comfort that one ought to have of the other both in prosperity and adversity. That marriage was purposed to provide mutual society meant that the effective relationship between a husband and wife came to be reframed and recentered within the purposes of the marriage. Essentially, this theological move began to shift love between spouses from kind of not so much the margins, but something that you had to kind of hope would materialise in some way or another, towards its centre. But this was not in the way that we think about it today. Osmond clarifies that the love that drew husband and wife together during the Reformation was a mutual willingness to make sacrifices for one another, hence a duty that developed within marriage. Early modern Christians could learn to love their spouses because they first respected their persons and shared common values. There's so much more we could say about the Reformation. Let's move on to one of its descendants, that is the Puritans of England and North America, whose theological identity is particularly traced back to Calvinist theology. Carhill notes that Calvin was chief among the reformers who presented marriage forthrightly as a covenantal relation in which spouses can achieve true companionship and mutual dedication. As they sought to establish, both in England and also the colonies in North America, a genuinely and thoroughly Christian society, the Puritans understood both this sort of marriage and the family that it produced to be critical. Again, as Cahill explains, for the Puritans of the 17th century England and America, faith is a powerful agent of education and reformation, and the family above all is the unit in which dedication to a Christian society is formed and fostered. This meant that the Puritan household became ground zero for religious formation and discipleship. So we see this in the words of some Puritan leaders themselves. A family is a little church and a little commonwealth, a school wherein the first principles and grounds of government and subjection are learned. Or, if ever we would have the Church of God to continue among us, we must bring it into our households and nourish it in our families. The family for the Puritans became the first and most important part of any and all relations. The flourishing of a Christian society was fundamentally reliant upon the flourishing not of the church, but of the individual Christian households in that society. The Puritans demonstrated genuine love and affection for their children, but this love also led them to have a rather, shall we say, unromantic view of their offspring. They recognised children to be dirty little rotten sinners, whose inclination towards evil required proactive and very early intervention. Because family was the primary arena in which spiritual formation was to take place, Puritan parents increasingly separated their children from those that they deemed to be bad influences, whether that was inside the household, for example, servants and apprentices, or whether it was outside it. Parents were also ever ready to exercise strict discipline over their children, especially once they moved beyond the age of 2. For the Puritans, companionship became an increasingly central purpose of marriage itself. Again, romantic infatuation or love was rarely a factor in the selection of your spouse. That was still a task that your parents had significant involvement in. But this decision was made on rational rather than emotional reasons. A key part of that rationality was marrying someone deemed to be of honourable character, because that would mean that affectionate companionship between you could actually come to exist. All of these factors and more meant that throughout the 17th and 18th century, emerging was a family with stronger affective bonds and clearer external boundaries. The invention of corridors for the first time allowed privacy within rooms. The dumbwaiter allowed a separation of the families on one floor and the servants of another. More affectionate child raising became normative. Marriage based on mutual affection was common, building on the established primacy of values and individualism and privacy. So, by the end of the early modern period, we're really beginning to see the building blocks of the household, which still a long way off from our contemporary ideal of the nuclear family, are nonetheless becoming much more familiar to us than the households of the prior 2,000 years. We're still a long way off, but we're getting there slowly. The emergence of the modern period had hugely significant implications for the household. Hugely. Until this era, the household, as we've seen, had been primarily a place of internal production. However, the Industrial Revolution changed all of that by shifting production out of the household and into the factory. Initially, men, women, and children alike, as young as 7 or 8, often sought work in industrial production. But as the capital market rose in line with industry, what emerged was a gradual but inexorable distinction between two different spheres of life, that is, between the home and the workplace. The Victorian period from around 1840 to 1900 proved to be foundational in reshaping and redefining the household. During that time, there emerged a very decisive distinction between the public and the private. For thousands of years, the home had strong outward-looking functionality and connections. But during this period, no longer a place of production, the home was now reshaped as a refuge from the world of work and business. The household dwelling, and increasingly those of the middle and upper classes, became increasingly privatised. This happened externally in the sense that the home became more and more a place of seclusion for the family who lived within it, but it also happened internally within the home, as evidenced by the changing nature of the shape of spaces within the home. Men started retreating to their libraries or their studies, women to their parlours, children lived in the nursery, servants lived in the kitchen and downstairs. Apprentices, workers and other clients increasingly lived in separate dwellings. The household became both more private and more individualised. This separation of the spheres of the private home and the public world had hugely significant implications as well for the relationships between men and women within the household. Rodney Clapp explains, the non-productive traditional household needed a wage earner to venture into the bitter world outside. This was, of course, the husband and father whose very soul and humanity were considered at danger as he was thrust into the marketplace. Now, he's not actually exaggerating here. It sounds a bit overblown. It's not. The world of industry and commerce in this period was considered to be a very dark and even dangerous place. By spending so much time in it, the man of the house was deemed to be at great risk emotionally, psychologically, and spiritually. And this was especially the case because in this era, the male sex was considered to be more prone to moral susceptibility than women, who were viewed as being more innately virtuous than men. And so it became the wife and the mother's special privilege and responsibility to create a nurturing home environment that was conducive to offsetting the dangerous world that her husband lived in. Women weren't relegated to the home because they were considered unfit for what lay outside it. Rather, as female author, I love this woman's name, Stickney Ellis is her name. Female author Stickney Ellis wrote in 1839, the sphere of women's happiest and most beneficial influence is the domestic one. Women's innately superior virtuous nature also came to be aligned with a heightened religious inclination. Regular church attendance by men began to steadily decline in this period, and the domestic home became more and more the central place for religious formation. As McDonnell explains, fathers were increasingly edged out of a Protestantism which stressed innocence, personal piety, individual education, and the sanctity of domestic sentiments. What did this all mean for the household and particularly the marital relationship? Well, as the spheres of home and work, private and public, women and men became ever more distinct from each other, men and women came to understand themselves as being in a very real sense incomplete without each other. A sphere divided is, after all, not really a sphere. Both hemispheres are needed to make it complete. And so throughout the 18th and then the early 19th century, marriage came to be seen as necessary, not for all sorts of other reasons, but particularly for the existential completion of men and women alike. And so for the first time in known human history, the measure of a successful marriage was how well a family met the emotional needs of its individual members. It was now viewed as a place of refuge from work, politics, and community obligations. The first 4 decades of the 20th century, we're almost there, were enormously challenging and very unsettling times. 2 world wars, millions upon millions dead, the Great Depression, and so much social, economic, and political volatility. During the Second World War, as many as 6 million additional women across the age spectrum had entered the American workforce, either filling the roles that needed to be filled because the men were off at the war front, or because the war was actually producing more industry needs, and so the women needed to meet those. But with the end of the Second World War came the returning soldiers, and the need for them to not only find suitable employment again, but also to find their place in society again. A war-torn Western population nostalgically longed for a return to peace and stability, to economic security and the way things were meant to be. And so the spheres of public and private, home and work, men and women, that had become necessarily a little bit blurred during those years of war, not only became separated once again, but even more so. Michelle Lee Barneswell observes how in the 1950s, the home was a place to gain a sense of identity, as Americans look to the home for happiness and satisfaction. The nostalgic longing, combined with rapidly increasing individualism and rapidly increasing economic growth, meant that the stereotypical 1950s Western household didn't simply become a renewed version of the Victorian household on steroids. It became something genuinely unprecedented. For example, no longer was the home the sphere in which women could exercise their happiest and most beneficial influence. Instead, it became where they found their ultimate and true identity. Women who departed from the norm of full-time homemaker were considered to be maladjusted, in active denial of their female identity. Meanwhile, husbands and fathers would head out of the home each day to fulfill their identity as breadwinner before returning to the haven of the home where they found their emotional and relational identity. The suburban family house became the household ideal, and the white picket fence became the metaphor for its self-contained privacy and its self-sustaining seclusion. Elaine Tyler May concludes that the legendary white middle-class family of the 1950s was not, as common wisdom tells us, the last gasp of traditional family life with roots deep in the past. Rather, it was the first wholehearted effort to create a home that would fulfill virtually all of its members' personal needs through an energised and expressive personal life. All of which brings us back to where we started, with that tweet that I began with, that the US, and we could say the Western world, has departed from a Christian ethic of romance, sex and family in popular behaviour the departure started in the 1960s. But it also brings us back to the same question I posed of that tweet at the beginning. The 1960s and the decades that followed certainly marked a departure from something. But a departure from what exactly? What is the Christian household? If by calling for a renewal of the traditional biblical or natural household or family, what we as Christians are actually referring to is marriage as a lifelong covenant between one man and one woman, sex as being only in the service of that marriage, children being born and raised within the context of that marriage, and that family having the alignment and the correspondence that we've heard it has with the household of God that Claire spoke about this morning, then that would be a wonderful thing. But that is not what we contemporary evangelicals actually mean, or at least only mean, by the traditional biblical natural nuclear family today. Bundled up in our 21st century ideal of the Christian household is a range of assumptions about what makes such a household genuinely Christian. There is the assumption that the bonds between Christian husbands and wives will be primarily and enduringly romantic, that this pre-existing affection is what gives rise to sacrificial love and the glue that holds the family together. Yet this was not the case for countless Christian households throughout the course of church history. There's an assumption that the household is self-contained, insular and self-sustaining, that the nucleus sits over here, removed from the rest of the atom, focusing on making sure it's got itself right, and only then determining how it's going to relate to anything outside it. Yet again, this was not the case for countless Christian households throughout much of church history. There is an assumption that the Christian household is the absolute primary place of spiritual formation for all within it. That for Christians, it's not the family of God, the church, which is our first and primary spiritual home, but instead our individual households. The Puritan words that I quoted earlier would be right at home in the 21st century evangelical pulpit. If ever we would have the church of God continue among us, we must bring it into our households and nourish it in our families. Now that is entirely true. We ought to be nourishing Christians' formation in our families. But it is this assumption of the household as the first Christian society that gives rise to these words from that same 2021 Desiring God article. We focus on the family because the biblical goal is for sanctified households to grow up in Christ and bear witness to him in all the world. Note the assumption there is not first and foremost that it's the church, Christ's body, which bears witness to him in all the world, but rather the Christian household, and hence we must focus on the family. But again, this was not the case for countless Christian households throughout most of church history. It doesn't make these things absolutely wrong. It doesn't mean that we're doing our family all the wrong way, but it does mean that we need to recognise that the household is a historically contingent institution, and that is still very much true for us today. Our contemporary evangelical idea of the Christian household is not based on some timeless ideal that we have special and privileged access to. We don't stand outside time and space with some sort of privileged perception which is completely ahistorical and purely theological. Instead, our familial commitments are also deeply embedded within and shaped by our own historical moment and our own historical location. What that means, as Clapp concludes, is that any attempt... I haven't got it, I have to read it to you. Might be on your sheet, actually. Clapp concludes that any attempt to move towards a more fully biblical interpretation of the Christian family's responsibilities and privileges in these foreboding but dazzling times must firstly bluntly challenge the evangelical traditionalist tendency to assume and assert that its conceptions of family is drawn directly and without mediation from the Bible. Let me just repeat that last sentence. Must firstly bluntly challenge the evangelical traditionalist tendency to assume and assert that its conceptions of family is drawn directly and without mediation from the Bible. So let me conclude by offering my tentative thesis, which needs a lot more clarification and qualification than I can give right now. But let me just go for it. I'm not so sure there is such a thing as the Christian household in terms of a particular form or expression of how we do family as Christians. Instead, I think there are households whose nature and character are defined by God, in which Christians live and relate as Christians are called to live and relate in the relationships that exist within those households. That is, the Bible doesn't provide us some sort of step-by-step 1+1 formula to make the Christian household. Instead, as the indwelling Spirit of God moves and works in each of us, God's word reveals to us how we are to live as Christ's people within our households, how we are to live as mothers and fathers, as children and kin, as sojourners and guests. Although perhaps I do speak too hastily, because as Claire has already reminded us this morning, Scripture does speak about a Christian household, indeed about the Christian household. But as it does that, it is not referring to our insular-looking 21st century privatised family units, nor is it referring to any other specific historical expression of the household. Instead, it speaks to the Christian household as the church, the household of God, built upon the foundation of the apostles and the prophets, Christ Jesus himself being the cornerstone, in whom the whole structure, being joined together, grows into a holy temple in the Lord. In him, you also are being built together into a dwelling place for God by the Spirit. As we've already heard from Claire this morning, this household, the church, that's God's household. It is the household in which his grand plan for our salvation and the salvation of countless others is realised in human history. And so if we're going to speak about the Christian household, surely this is a household that we should have front and centre. Thank you.